July 10, 1944, Normandy, France. 14 hours. The sun was shining over the Cotentin Peninsula, a cruel irony for the men of the U.S. First Army who were dying in the mud below. From the air, the landscape looked like a beautiful, intricate quilt of emerald green squares. But on the ground, it was a labyrinth designed by the devil himself. This was the Bocage. For 2,000 years, French farmers had been marking their property lines not with wooden fences, but with earth. They dug ditches and piled the soil up into massive embankments, some reaching 5 feet thick and 8 feet high. Over centuries, the roots of hawthorn, brambles, ancient oaks, and elms had woven through these earthen walls, creating a natural composite material that was stronger than reinforced concrete. To the American planners in London, looking at aerial reconnaissance photos, these were just hedges. To the men of the 2nd Armored Division, they were coffins. Corporal Frank Richards wiped the sweat from his eyes inside the stifling hull of his M4 Sherman tank, named Battling Bitch. The internal temperature was hovering around 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The air smelled of diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of fear. Richards was 22 years old, a kid from Ohio who had grown up driving tractors. Now he was trying to navigate a 33-ton war machine through a puzzle where every turn led to a dead end. "Driver, move up. Slow," the commander's voice crackled in the headset. "Watch the corners." Richards engaged the gear. The Sherman lurched forward. The lane they were in was sunken, centuries of cart traffic having eroded the roadbed until it was essentially a trench. They were blind. The high hedges on either side blocked all peripheral vision. They could only see what was directly in front of them. And directly in front of them was a wall of dirt and roots. "We can't go through it, Sarge," Richard said. "It's too thick." "Then go over it. Climb it. We need to see what's in the next field." This was the fatal flaw in American tactics. To cross a hedgerow, a tank had to drive up the embankment. As the tracks gripped the dirt and the tank pitched upward at a 45-degree angle, two catastrophic things happened simultaneously. First, the tank's main gun pointed uselessly at the sky, unable to fire at anything but clouds. Second, and far more deadly, the tank exposed its underbelly. The M4 Sherman had decent frontal armor, about 50 millimeters thick and sloped to deflect shells. But the floor of the tank? The belly armor was only 12 to 25 millimeters thick. It was designed to protect against landmines, not high-velocity anti-tank rounds. As Richards punched the accelerator, the Sherman roared and began to climb the wall. The nose rose. The belly was exposed. 150 yards away, across the field, Gefreiter, Private Hans Müller, looked through the optical sight of his 7.5-centimeter PK-40 anti-tank gun. He didn't need to calculate windage. He didn't need to lead the target. He had been staring at the top of that specific hedgerow for 4 hours, waiting for the American tank to rear up like a horse. "Fire!" his sergeant whispered. The gun cracked. The shell, a Pesger 39 armor-piercing projectile, crossed the distance in less than 0.2 seconds. Richards never heard the shot. He felt a sledgehammer blow that lifted the 33-ton tank off the ground. The shell punched through the thin floor armor directly beneath the driver's seat. It didn't just enter, it spalled, sending a shower of molten metal fragments swirling through the crew compartment at supersonic speeds. The ammunition rack stored in the sponsons ignited instantly. A Sherman carried nearly 100 rounds of high-explosive 75mm shells. When they cooked off, the pressure inside the hull spiked to levels that popped the turret off its ring. Richards, the commander, the loader, the gunner, the bow gunner, 5 men with families, dreams, and futures, were vaporized in a chemical fire that burned at 2,000 degrees Celsius. From a foxhole 50 yards behind the burning tank, Sergeant Curtis Culin watched the black pillar of smoke rise into the summer sky. He didn't flinch. He didn't scream. He just watched, his jaw muscles tightening until they ached. Culin was 29 years old. He wasn't an officer. He wasn't a strategist. Before the war, he drove a taxi in the congested, angry streets of Summit, New Jersey. He knew how to fix a carburetor with a paperclip. He knew how to negotiate traffic. He was a man of practical solutions, a tinkerer, the kind of guy who had a garage full of half-finished projects. Currently, he was a tank commander in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, and he was watching the greatest army in history lose a war against shrubbery. Chapter 2. The Failure of the Engineers. The destruction of Richards's tank wasn't an isolated incident. It was the norm. By July 12th, the American advance had stalled completely. The casualty rates were horrifying. In some battalions, lieutenant life expectancy was measured in days. The infantry couldn't advance without tanks to suppress the German machine guns. The tanks couldn't advance because they couldn't cross the hedges without getting killed. General Omar Bradley, the GI's general, was desperate. He threw the entire weight of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers at the problem. They were brilliant men with degrees from West Point and MIT. They approached the problem with textbooks and slide rules. And they failed. First, they tried bulldozers. The Army brought up D7 Caterpillar bulldozers to push through the mounds. It seemed logical. But there were huge problems. First, the bulldozers were slow, painfully slow. Second, the hydraulic arms and the radiator were completely exposed. A single German sniper with a Mauser rifle could disable the machine or kill the driver, who sat high up in an open cab, exposed like a target at a carnival shooting gallery. After losing a dozen dozers in 2 days, the operators refused to go near the front lines. Next, they tried dynamite. The engineers developed a tactic where 2 sappers would crawl forward under fire, carrying 50-pound satchel charges of TNT. They had to burrow into the roots of the hedge, plant the charges, wire them, crawl back, and blow a hole. Culin watched one such attempt on July 13th. 2 engineers crawled out. One was shot in the leg halfway there. The other managed to plant the charge. When it detonated, it blew a glorious gap in the hedge. But the explosion was a dinner bell. Every German mortar team in the sector zeroed in on the smoke. When the first American tank tried to drive through the new gap, it drove straight into a pre-sighted kill zone. 3 mortar shells landed on top of it before it cleared the dust. The smart solutions were getting men killed. The Army was paralyzed. That evening, the mood in the 102nd Cavalry bivouac was funereal. Men sat cleaning their weapons in silence. The only sound was the distant rumble of artillery and the chirping of crickets. Culin was sitting on a crate of K rations, turning a piece of shrapnel over in his hands. His hands were stained with grease that no amount of soap could remove. He was thinking about the geometry of the problem. The tank goes up. The belly shows. We die. The tank needs to stay down. How do you make a tank go through a wall without lifting its nose? Private Roberts, a young soldier from the Tennessee backwoods, was sitting nearby, aggressively sharpening a bayonet. Roberts wasn't an engineer either. He was a farm boy. He knew about stumps, roots, and hard earth. "This is stupid, Sarge," Roberts muttered, spitting tobacco juice onto the French soil. "We got 30 tons of steel and a 400-horsepower engine, and we're getting stopped by bushes. If this was a stump in my daddy's field, We wouldn't try to climb it." Culin looked up. "What would you do, Roberts?" "I'd dig it out," Roberts said. "I'd put a plow on the tractor and I'd rip it out by the roots. We don't need tanks right now. We need teeth. We need giant saws to cut this crap down." Teeth. The word hit Culin like a physical blow. He dropped the shrapnel. He stood up and walked over to his tank. He ran his hand over the smooth cast steel transmission cover on the nose of the Sherman. It was rounded, aerodynamic, perfect for deflecting bullets, and completely useless for digging. "Teeth," Culin whispered. If he could mount a set of prongs, strong, sharp tusks, to the front of the tank, low to the ground, when the tank hit the hedge, the teeth would bite into the roots. The resistance would pin the nose of the tank down, not up. The tank would use its own momentum to slice through the bank instead of climbing it. But where do you get steel strong enough to cut through centuries-old oak roots? You couldn't use scrap metal from a destroyed truck. It was too soft. It would bend like tin foil. You needed hardened, industrial-grade steel. Culin looked west, towards the coast, towards Omaha Beach. He remembered the landing. He remembered the terror of the water. But mostly he remembered the obstacles. Rommel's Czech Hedgehogs, 6-foot-tall stars of steel. Massive I-beams welded together, anchored in concrete, designed to rip the bottoms out of 4,000-ton landing ships. That was German steel. Krupp steel, the hardest metal on Earth. Millions of tons of it were sitting on the beach, rusting in the salt spray, doing nothing but annoying the supply trucks. Culin turned to Roberts. A grin spread across his face, white teeth flashing in the grime. "Roberts, grab the welding torch and find a truck. We're going shopping." Chapter 3. The Midnight Heist. It was strictly forbidden to leave the bivouac area at night. It was strictly forbidden to enter the beach zone without a pass. It was absolutely forbidden to modify government property without authorization from the Ordnance Department. Culin didn't care. At 01 hours on July 14th, Culin, Roberts, and 2 other mechanics piled into a 2.5-ton GMC truck. They had an oxyacetylene welding rig in the back, a set of heavy sledgehammers, and a bottle of confiscated French cognac for courage. The drive to the beach was a nightmare in itself. They drove without headlights, navigating by the pale moonlight and the distant flashes of artillery. The road was jammed with convoys moving ammo to the front, but Culin talked his way past the MPs, claiming he had urgent specialized repair orders from HQ. His confidence was his badge. They reached the dunes of Omaha Beach at 2:30. The tide was out. The beach, which had been a slaughterhouse a month ago, was now a vast logistical depot. But further down, in the uncleared sectors, the German defenses still stood. "There," Culin pointed. In the moonlight, the Czech hedgehogs looked like giant skeletal caltrops. They were ominous, jagged, and heavy. "Let's get to work," Culin said. "We need the angled sections, 4 feet long, and we need a lot of them." He lit the torch. The pop of the ignition sounded like a gunshot. He adjusted the mix until the flame hissed with a perfect, deadly blue cone. He knelt in the wet sand and touched the flame to the German steel. Sparks showered over him like a fountain of gold. The smell of ozone mixed with the salt air. This wasn't thin sheet metal. This was a 6-inch steel beam. It took 10 minutes of intense, sweating labor to make a single cut. The metal glowed angry red, then white. "Keep a lookout," Culin shouted over the roar of the torch. "If the MPs see this light, we're in the brig. If a German plane sees it, we're dead." They worked like men possessed. Cut, hammer, heave. The beams were incredibly heavy, over 100 pounds for a 4-foot section. Roberts and the mechanics dragged the scorching metal through the sand, burning their gloves, their muscles screaming. They threw them into the back of the truck with a deafening clang. 1 beam, 2 beams, 10, 20. At 04 hour, a Jeep patrol approached. Headlights swept the dunes. "Kill the torch," Roberts hissed. Culin shut off the gas. The sudden darkness was blinding. They dove behind the truck, hearts hammering against their ribs. The Jeep rolled past slowly, the MPs scanning the beach. They paused, lighting cigarettes, looking right at the dark shape of the truck. Culin gripped his .45 pistol, not knowing what he would do. He wasn't going to shoot an MP, but he wasn't going to stop either. After an agonizing minute, the Jeep revved up and drove on. "That was too close," one mechanic whispered. "Fire it back up," Culin commanded. "We're not done." They returned to the unit just as the sun was breaking over the hedgerows. They were exhausted, covered in soot, and smelling of burnt metal. But in the back of the truck lay the severed limbs of the Atlantic Wall. Now came the hard part. They had the material. Now they had to build the monster. Chapter 4, The Frankenstein Tank, July 14, 1944. 08 hours. The field workshop. Sleep was a luxury they couldn't afford. Culin drove the truck straight to his tank. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't draw blueprints. He worked from the image burned into his mind. "Weld them here," Culin instructed, pointing to the towing shackles on the final drive housing of the Sherman. "And here, along the lower glacis plate." The idea was to create a set of 4 tusks, protruding forward and slightly downward. They had to be strong enough to take the impact of a 30-ton vehicle hitting a solid wall at 15 miles per hour. If the welds failed, the tank would simply run over its own teeth and throw a track, leaving it helpless. The welding machine hummed. Culin, formerly a taxi driver who worried about scratching the paint on a yellow cab, was now fusing heavy structural steel to the hull of a war machine. He laid beads of weld that were thick, ugly, and incredibly strong. He made multiple passes, building up the metal, reinforcing the joints with triangular gussets cut from the scrap. By noon, the prototype was ready. It looked terrifying. The sleek, rounded nose of the Sherman was gone. In its place was a jagged, aggressive maw of rusty steel prongs. It looked like a rhinoceros that had been crossbred with a bulldozer. "It's the ugliest thing I've ever seen," Roberts said, admiring their handiwork. "Let's see if it works," Culin replied. They found a test section of hedgerow in a rear area, a massive overgrown wall that had stopped a light tank the day before. A crowd of soldiers gathered. Skepticism was high. They had seen the bulldozers fail. They had seen the dynamite fail. Why would some scrap metal welded by a taxi driver work? Culin climbed into the commander's hatch. "Button up," he ordered. "Driver, hit it. Full speed. Don't lift off." The engine revved. The tank kicked up a cloud of dust. Inside, Culin braced himself. This was the moment of truth. If this failed, he would likely be court-martialed for damaging government property. If it worked, the tank hit the wall at 12 miles per hour. Usually, there would be a violent lurch upwards. Instead, there was a sound like the earth tearing apart. Crack crunch. The German steel teeth bit into the base of the hedge. The force of the impact was transferred downward, keeping the tank's tracks flat on the ground. The tank didn't climb. It shoved. With a groan of tearing roots, the entire section of the hedgerow, dirt, bushes, trees and all, was lifted up and pushed forward. The tank drove through the wall, carrying a massive mat of vegetation in front of it like a shield. It emerged on the other side in 3 seconds. The breach was wide, clean, and safe. The tank's gun remained level the entire time, ready to fire. The soldiers watching stood in stunned silence for a heartbeat. Then they erupted, cheering, yelling, throwing helmets in the air. Culin climbed out. He looked at the teeth. They were shiny from the abrasion, but the welds held. News traveled up the chain of command at lightning speed. Within hours, a convoy of staff cars arrived. Out stepped General Omar Bradley himself, accompanied by his senior staff. Bradley was a no-nonsense man. He walked around the modified tank, inspecting the crude welds, kicking the prongs with his polished boot. "Sergeant," Bradley said, looking Culin in the eye, "did you design this?" "I just welded it, sir. It was a group effort." Bradley looked at the hedgerow, decimated by the machine. He looked at the miles of impenetrable terrain on the map. "It's crude," Bradley said. Then he smiled, a rare, grim expression. "But it looks like it wants to kill something. How many of these can you make?" "Give me the welders, sir, and I'll make them all." Chapter 5. The Factory of War. General Bradley didn't just give an order. He changed the entire logistical flow of the First Army. He issued a directive that same afternoon. The Rhino modification is Priority Alpha. All available ordnance personnel are to be reassigned to Sergeant Culin's detail immediately. Suddenly, Culin wasn't just a sergeant. He was the foreman of the most important factory in France. But there was a catch. Operation Cobra, the massive breakout offensive designed to smash the German lines, was scheduled for July 25th. It was July 15th. They had 10 days to modify 500 tanks. The math was brutal, 50 tanks a day. They needed more steel, much more steel. The raids on the beach intensified. It became a massive operation. Convoys of trucks, guarded by MPs, stripped the beaches of the Cottontail Peninsula bare. The iron harvest had begun. Combat engineers blasted the concrete anchors of the hedgehogs, and cranes loaded the twisted crosses onto flatbeds. Back at the depots, the scene was apocalyptic. Imagine a field filled with hundreds of tanks. Now imagine 50 welding torches running simultaneously, 24 hours a day. The noise was deafening, a constant high-pitched electrical scream of arc welders, the rhythmic pounding of sledgehammers, the roar of engines. At night, the area glowed with a ghostly blue-violet light. Men worked until they dropped. Welders suffered from arc eye, their retinas burned by the UV light because they didn't have enough proper helmets and used cardboard with slits instead. They wrapped wet rags around their faces to filter the fumes of burning paint and galvanized steel. Culin didn't sleep. He moved from tank to tank, inspecting the angles. "Too high," he would yell at a lieutenant from the engineering corps. "If you mount it that high, it'll catch on the road and snap the transmission housing. Lower, 18 inches off the ground." It was a strange inversion of hierarchy. Majors and captains were taking orders from a taxi driver sergeant because he was the only one who understood the feel of the metal. They ran out of welding rods. They raided naval repair ships for more. They ran out of oxygen. They flew in canisters from England. They ran out of German steel. They started cutting up destroyed railroad tracks and debris from bombed bridges. By July 24th, the day before the attack, the 2nd Armored Division looked different. The sleek lines of the American armor were gone. The tanks looked feral. They bristled with jagged, rusty iron. They looked like ancient beasts of war. They had modified over 600 tanks and tank destroyers. General Bradley came to inspect the line one last time. He saw rows of rhinos stretching to the horizon. "Sergeant Culin," Bradley said, "I hope you're right, because tomorrow morning thousands of lives depend on your welding." Chapter 6. Thunder Run, July 25, 1944. 09:38, hours, south of St. Lo. The beginning of Operation Cobra was the loudest sound ever created by human beings up to that point in history. 1,500 heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s, flew over the German lines. They dropped 4,000 tons of high explosives in a box just 4 miles long and 1 mile wide. The ground shook so violently that men in tanks 3 miles away threw up from the vibration. The Panzer Lehr Division, the elite of the German army, was turned into dust. But the survivors were still there, digging out of the rubble, manning their guns, waiting for the Americans to come down the roads. Colonel Hans von Luck of the German forces rallied his men. "Hold the roads," he ordered. "They must come by the roads. The hedges protect our flanks." He was counting on the old rules of war. He was counting on the Americans being stopped by the bushes. He was wrong. "All units, advance," the radio command went out to the 2nd Armored. Sergeant Culin was back in his tank. He wasn't welding anymore. He was leading the charge. "Driver, pick a spot, any spot, and go." The engine roared. Culin's tank surged toward a massive hedgerow to the left of the road. To a German observer in a church steeple a mile away, it looked like madness. The tank was going to crash. Crash. The rhino hit the wall. The teeth dug in. The hedge exploded. Culin's tank burst through the foliage, covered in dirt and branches, looking like a moving forest. He didn't stop. He crossed the field in seconds. Then he hit the next hedge. Crash. Another breach. All along the line, hundreds of rhino tanks were doing the same. They weren't using the roads. They were ignoring the roads completely. They were surging cross-country, cutting through the landscape like it wasn't there. Inside the German lines, panic set in. Oberleutnant Weber, commanding a PaK-40 anti-tank gun, was watching the road. Suddenly, the hedge behind him disintegrated. He spun around to see a Sherman tank emerging from the solid earth, its machine guns blazing. "Panzers inside the perimeter," he screamed into his radio. "They are coming through the walls. They are everywhere." The German defense was based on fixed angles of fire covering the roads. But the Americans were now coming from every direction. They were flanking the pillboxes. They were crushing the mortar pits under their tracks. Culin's platoon cut through 7 hedgerows in 20 minutes. They emerged directly into the rear area of a German supply column. It was a massacre. The Germans were parked, eating lunch, expecting the front line to be miles away. Suddenly, 5 steel monsters with iron teeth burst out of the woods. Culin's gunner fired the .50 caliber. Trucks exploded. Fuel tankers turned into fireballs. The Germans ran, dropping their rifles, terrified by these tanks that seemed to possess supernatural powers of mobility. By sunset, the 2nd Armored Division had advanced 6 miles. In the previous 3 weeks, they hadn't advanced 6 miles in total. They had broken the back of the German defense. The stalemate was over. The rhinos were running wild in the French countryside, and there was nothing between them and Paris. Chapter 7. The Cost of Innovation. The breakout was a triumph, but war always collects its debt. In the 48 hours following the launch of Operation Cobra, the Rhino tanks led a blitzkrieg that rivaled anything the Germans had done in 1940. General Patton, taking command of the Third Army, used the gap Culin had created to pour hundreds of thousands of men into the French interior. The statistics, compiled months later by War Department analysts, were staggering. In the units equipped with Culin's rhinos, the casualty rate for tank crews dropped by 45%. Before the rhinos, the exchange ratio was brutal. For every German tank destroyed, the Americans lost 4 or 5 Shermans. With the rhinos allowing them to flank and ambush, the ratio evened out. But numbers on a page don't bleed. Sergeant Curtis survived the breakout. He rode his rhino across France, through Belgium, and to the border of Germany. He became a legend in the division, the taxi driver engineer. But his luck ran out in the Hurtgen forest in November 1944. The Hurtgen was a dark, dense forest full of mines and artillery. The rhino teeth were useless there. The trees were too thick, the ground too muddy. Culin was scouting a position on foot. He stepped on a German shoe mine, a small wooden box filled with TNT, designed specifically to maim. The explosion took his leg. The man who had given the entire U.S. Army its mobility, who had figured out how to make tanks walk through walls, was carried off the battlefield on a stretcher, his war over. He was shipped back to the United States. He spent months in a hospital bed, learning to walk with a prosthetic limb. General Bradley didn't forget him. In a ceremony at the hospital, Culin was awarded the Legion of Merit, an award almost exclusively reserved for high-ranking officers for exceptionally meritorious conduct. The citation read, "For the development of the device known as the rhino plow, which permitted the armor to crash through the hedgerows, saving countless lives." Countless lives. Historians later tried to count them. Based on the casualty rates before and after the invention, it is estimated that the rhino device saved approximately 3,500 to 4,000 American soldiers from death or severe injury during the Normandy breakout. 3,500 men who got to go home. 3,500 men who had children and grandchildren. A small city of people alive today because a taxi driver looked at a pile of rusty scrap metal and saw a solution. After the war, the rhinos met a quiet end. As the army moved into Germany and the terrain changed to open plains and autobahns, the hedgerow cutters became unnecessary dead weight. Crews cut them off with the same torches used to weld them on. The teeth were thrown into scrap piles in Belgium and Germany, melted down to rebuild the very cities they had helped conquer. Curtis Culin returned to New Jersey. He went back to a quiet life. He worked as a salesman. He raised a family. He rarely talked about the war. He didn't tell people at the bar that he had personally solved the biggest tactical nightmare of the Western Front. He died in 1963 at the age of 48 from heart complications. But his legacy isn't in a museum. You can see it in the doctrine of modern warfare. Culin proved that innovation doesn't always come from the top down. It doesn't always come from a laboratory with white-coated scientists. Sometimes the most important breakthroughs come from the guy in the mud, from the mechanic with dirty fingernails who looks at a billion-dollar problem and fixes it with a piece of junk and a welding torch. Culin taught the U.S. military a lesson they still teach today: adapt or die. The next time you see footage of World War II, watch the tanks. Look closely at the nose of the Shermans breaking out of Normandy. You might see the ghostly, jagged outline of the teeth. Those represent the triumph of American ingenuity. A taxi driver, a rusty German beam, and the will to break through. This was the story of the Rhino tank. If you want to see more incredible stories of ingenuity under fire, stories that you won't find in the history textbooks, you need to subscribe to this channel right now. Click that red button. Ring the bell. We upload new, shocking, fact-filled documentaries every single day. Don't miss the next one.